Joining us today is former senior diplomat Ambassador Mohan Kumar to shed light on the ongoing Russia-Ukraine conflict and India's crucial role when it comes to resolving this. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, a very warm welcome to the broadcast, first of all. Okay, to begin with, how critical is National Security Advisor Ajit Dovals' visit to Moscow in the larger framework of India's peace mediation efforts? And given the ongoing dynamics of Russia-Ukraine conflict, why is now a pivotal moment for Dovals' visit? And what impact might it have on the potential for dialogue?
So thank you very much for having me. I think the National Security Advisor's visit to Moscow must be seen in the context of a follow-up to the Prime Minister's own visit to Moscow in July, and then his subsequent visit to Kiev when the Prime Minister met with Zelensky. So one way of looking at it is that, of course, the National Security Advisor is going to Moscow to participate in the BRICS NSA conference. But then what happens in these multilateral meetings is that a number of meetings happen on the margins of the multilateral meeting itself. So I'm very sure the National Security Advisor will take this opportunity to meet with his counterpart in Moscow, the Russian interlocutors, to whom he can then do two things. One, convey to him the conversation that Prime Minister of India had with Zelensky in Kiev. And two, to gauge from them their reaction to what Zelensky may have conveyed to Prime Minister Modi. So far, I see India's role as a facilitator, not as a mediator. As a facilitator who's actually taking messages indirectly from one party to the other, just to see if both parties can be brought together at a subsequent stage.
Okay. Mr. Kumar, recently, Italy's Prime Minister also mentioned India as one of the key countries that could play a role in resolving the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now, how does this recognition of India's potential influence, like you were also mentioning, reflect the country's growing stature in global diplomacy?
Oh, I think that's absolutely spot on. There is no question in my mind that there are only a handful of countries who are now competent to even play this messenger role. I mean, we are not even talking of a role of mediation so far. It could be in the future, but right now, even taking messages from one party to the other is such a difficult task. And the fact that the Prime Minister of India is one of the few leaders who can actually go to Moscow, talk to Putin, and then go to Kiev and talk to Zelensky itself puts India in a very prime position. It's certainly a recognition of two or three things. One, in the fact that India took a neutral position in this conflict, because if you take too one-sided a position, then your chance as a facilitator or a mediator becomes impossible. Second, as you rightly say, India is now seen as a leader of the global south. India is finally seen as a country with gravitas and clout. So no wonder the Italian Prime Minister talks of India. Of course, she also mentioned China, I have to say. But I think she's talking about just a handful of countries, and very frankly, if there is any role to be played, it can only be played by either India or by China and Brazil. But I want to draw your audience to the attention of the fact that China and Brazil have already exhausted their possibility by putting up a peace plan which did not fly.
I'll come to that,
not fly.
I'll just come to that. Sir, President Putin has mentioned India alongside China and Brazil as a country with which he remains in regular contact regarding the Ukraine conflict. While China has proposed, it had proposed a 12-point plan with specific principles. Now you were saying that opportunity has been lost. Do you think India's more flexible approach makes it better positioned to facilitate open-ended talks?
I think India has been more
because perhaps you don't give a structured plan, maybe.
No, I think India has taken a more dispassionate and objective view on the conflict itself. The Chinese-Brazilian plan basically said that Russia must I'm sorry, Ukraine must forget about the territories occupied by Russia. So that put off the Ukrainians completely. Ukraine said we cannot accept it. I think India has been smart in not trying to second guess the outcome of a negotiated solution. If you're going to be a facilitator or a messenger, and then subsequently a mediator if possible, you cannot second guess the outcome. The outcome must be a negotiated outcome between the parties. It cannot be imposed by any mediator or facilitator. So I see it as smart diplomacy by India that we have not taken a position as to what happens with the territories occupied by Russia, what happens with incursions made by Ukraine into Russian territory, and we have not given our cards or revealed our cards about the ultimate eventual outcome.
But
I think
sir,
that's where I think we've been smart.
Okay, but sir, the stance has always been clear that solution will only come through dialogue and diplomacy, and this is not the era of war.
Oh, absolutely. I think that is one point on which India has turned out to be absolutely correct. Within 2 months of the conflict, the Indian Prime Minister said diplomacy and dialogue is the way forward. And then, as you rightly say, the Prime Minister told Putin in the Astana conference a couple of years ago that, listen, this is not the era of war. And he has also told President Zelensky now that India is on the side of peace. So if there is one country which has steadfastly said diplomacy and dialogue is the way forward, that is India. And it appears to me that the whole world now realizes this cannot be decided on the battlefield. It will have to be decided on the negotiating table.
Sir, what does India bring to the table that other global powers don't? If you could just explain this to our audience.
Yes, I think India, as I said, brings to the table a certain amount of objectivity and neutrality that others don't. Secondly, we have maintained good relations with both parties. Russia, certainly, because we have an old legacy relationship with Russia. But as you notice, the PM was equally comfortable in Kiev, talking to Zelensky, putting his arm around his shoulder, trying to comfort him when he went to the children's hospital. So I think we are one party which is seen as capable of dealing with both sides. Thirdly, I do believe sincerely that India carries with it the voice of the global South. No country in the global South wants this war to continue because it has had a terribly negative impact on most countries of the global South. For all these reasons, I believe India has gravitas and a particular specific role and prestige that not many countries in the world possess.
All right, sir, last question before I let you go. Now, with PM Modi's visits to Russia and Ukraine, then holding telephonic conversation with President Putin and President Biden discussing the issue, all these things happening, do you have an expected timeline for when this conflict might come to an end, or are we still in the early stages of diplomacy?
I think your last point is valid. Both parties are intensifying the conflict, and that normally happens just before people enter the negotiating table because they want to enter negotiations from a position of strength. If you ask me why Ukraine has chosen to attack Kursk within Russian territory, the only logic I can see is that Ukraine wants to go to the negotiating table vis-a-vis Russia from a position of strength. So I don't think we are there yet.
But do you think that's a valid move?
I think it is valid. I think the Ukraine wants to have some cards with it when it goes to the negotiating table. Otherwise, it is Russia which holds all the cards now, because it is Russia which occupies 20% of Ukrainian territory. Ukraine doesn't have many cards with it, other than the fact that it is supported by the Western NATO. So I believe the Ukrainian incursion into Kursk was precisely so that at a later stage, Ukraine can say, okay, if you can give up some territory, we will give up Kursk. That seems to be the only logic. I'm not a military expert, but it seems to me the most optimistic interpretation of this intensification of conflict is that they could reach the point of military exhaustion by the end of the year, and sometime in the first quarter of next year, you could contemplate diplomatic negotiations.
All right, it was wonderful talking to you, sir, and thank you so much for coming onto the broadcast today and enlightening us on this particular issue and giving your thoughts.